Hello everyone. The name is Mike Levin. The date is Friday, March 18th, 2022. I like to verbally date stamp my videos because it reminds me of who I am and when I am. Where I am, often self-evident. To anyone who follows me, they know I am probably on the drive to pick up my child. And digging at it out here in the Poconos. It's an interesting thing to hang up one identity. Mike Levin, SEO in NYC, New York City, and assume the identity of Mike Levin. Poconos Pythonista? I think I'll stay. And the time has come, the Walrus said, to speak of why I always refer to the Walrus and the Carpenter in my videos, in life. I think of it. It's a working metaphor. There's metaphors spinning through your head. Symbols, representations for things that exist in some wonderful, pure form, and usually in the form of a story. Characters introduced in a story. The tortoise and the hare. The world is full of these things that really illustrate a point. Like when I say the tortoise and the hare, you instantly know slow and steady wins the race. Naturally endowed show-offs who goof off a lot are at a disadvantage compared to those of steady-minded will and determination. The desire to do a thing often counts for more than nature-given traits. Strength, speed, agility, smarts, that sort of thing. So the Walrus and the Carpenter are another such set of characters. And I think a lot of people miss the point. And Disney at least makes it known. Who would know the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland books, including the first one by that name and the second one called Through the Looking Glass, were it not for the Disney adaptations. Now, granted, they were already popular books, and in fact, at one point, I do believe they were endorsed by the Queen of England herself, who was the very one being lampooned in the books. It's very much a story of, the characters in British society at the time the book was written. And it was hardly making a point at all. It was a book about nonsense, and yet hit so many fundamentals so well because, truth can be delivered as little snippets of personality profile, traits, vignettes, whatever you want to call it. But, a stereotype. And, just because stereotypes are bad does not mean that they don't have value as first-order approximations. So hash systems for fast lookups deal with, the very easy to categorize, then the more drilled down, less easy to categorize, but still easy since you peeled off that outer layer, and so on until you have high-performance lookups on key value pairs against, millions, even billions of potential records. Still, it's instantaneous and snappy. It's because the 80-20 rule is being applied to so many places, specifically first-order approximations of character type. So the Walrus character type is the talker and the poser and the politician and the Pied Piper, motivator of people to do things on their behalf. It sounds very adult. Well, it's also very childlike. It's the characteristic traits of an infant who has not learned to take care of themselves yet, and they use the only tools at their disposal, crying like a baby, to get their needs met. When we get adept at language, we learn how to do that with fancier longer and more involved language to hide the fact that it's crying like a baby. That's the walrus. The walrus's job is to motivate the natural resources, the raw material around them, to be their food. To either be their food or to get their food. So to be their food, in the case of the oysters, it's very triggering, I've learned, for a lot of people. And if you're not thinking about it on the intellectual level, it does seem very horrible. These anthropomorphized sentient oysters actually getting eaten by the walrus in the Disney adaptation of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is funny because the poem doesn't even appear in a book by that name. It's from the second book, Through the Looking Glass. So, along with Tweedledum and Tweedledee, they don't appear till the second book, but the movie adaptation almost opens up with them. So, Disney has taken a lot of liberty, and it pisses off Alice purists. And I've met some of them. I've seen plays by homeschoolers putting on the Alice story as book purists. And his story is different. There's a lot about the mouse and stuff. It's almost all skipped because it's British erudition, and it wouldn't play well with the American audience. So they stripped out and they moved stuff around. But one of the things they did is they put the walrus in the Carpenter poem right up front and fairly accurately portrayed it. But, they dropped things like, if 7 maids with 7 mops swept for half a year, do you suppose the walrus said that they could sweep it clear? I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. How popular would the movie have been if they rambled on like that? So they smoothed out that poem, and they made the Carpenter not get a bite of the oysters and get angry and come after the walrus with a hammer. Which gets to the other character in this set, the walrus and the Carpenter. Whereas the walrus has stayed at that very childlike state and can only get its needs met by yabbering on, the Carpenter is quite a bit more sophisticated and refined, having developed non-verbal trades, a skill, a craft, carpentry. Carpentry reoccurs so many places as like a key indicator of a capable person whose value comes from within because they've taken the time to know a trade, to learn the tools, to practice. And really, I've made it a point lately pointing out the Charlie Brown kicking the football and having Lucy pull it away. People don't recognize these metaphors. Well, they can stand for a lot of different things. So just where I'm covering the walrus and the Carpenter, I have to tell you that one of the subsets of the Carpenter character type is the Charlie Brown kicking at that football and landing on its back. Because that's what success feels like. Success feels like kicking that football and landing on your back a lot until it doesn't, because you'll get it with practice, with what, it's hard to use another word. It's with practice. There's a lot of other things you could say there, like keep yourself going in various forms, rah-rah cheerleading, but the honest to goodness truth is this is where being human is separated from being more base-like in your personality, more animal-like, more like an infant, an adolescent, a toddler in your, adult personality. Which child type are you in your adult personality when you're the walrus? Well, some form of someone who needs to motivate people to do their bidding so they can get their needs met in life, because they're not going to get over that obstacle to get good at something. And all the related details involved in converting the pure skill of being good at something into feeling good about it, being able to make a living at it when you want to, not getting sick of it because you also get paid for it. These are all very important hurdles to be overcome, any of which can destroy a passion. If you do for a living what you do for love, and there's other people whose compromising influences will be exerted on your work because you're doing it for pay, then it's better to not do for a living what is your true passion. I would stay away from it in that case. So I'm a funny one who started out in graphic design at Drexel University. Drexel, this engineering computer school. And I started out in the school for mechanical engineering with visions of I wanted to be in the wave of people colonizing Mars. That was really on my mind in 1988, 89, when I was going into college. 89, 90, 91, 92. I graduated in 92 after 4 years having a work-study program, what was called a Drexel, a co-op. And for my co-op, I worked at Commodore Computers. Yes, I worked for one of the key computer companies that created the home computer industry and the blending together of video games and computers, making it okay for your computer to also be a game machine. Commodore could have been today's Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, really, all rolled into one. They had everything. They had all the components. They just didn't have the leadership, and they were deeply plagued by not invented here complex. So a bunch of carpenters, right? So carpenters have weaknesses too. Being a carpenter doesn't make you across the board a better class of person than being a walrus. However, being a carpenter does make you more human. Thus, the representation of these two characters as something that's anthropomorphized into a sentient being, but nonetheless portrayed as the walrus. And then the other one being portrayed as a human trade, the carpenter. This is the channeling, this is the deep channeling of truth. So, those who channel as the younger human model, prototype, stage, what have you, is also clearly the more powerful one, the leader, the one in the position of, leadership, but in the end of the Disney interpretation is running away from an angry, hammer-wielding carpenter. That was not in the poem. In the poem, the carpenter said nothing but, pass us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. So, clearly the carpenter is getting their share of the oysters in the Alice book, in the second book of Alice, Through the Looking Glass. And oysters get shit part of the deal, but the walruses clearly are a subject of interpretation, in some cases getting the short end of the stick, as in Disney's interpretation, the more cynical interpretation, or they are in collusion with the proletariat? Bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, something like that. This is all recurring themes. This is all through history. There are the haves and there are the have-nots. And, Wealth and Power 101, the first priority of the haves is to fortify that which they have and to keep the have-nots from getting anything that the haves have, you see. So, that's human nature. And even though that's only about that 50% of the population who are the rotten, thieving dogs who feel that way, who will be victims of absolute power, corrupts absolutely, even though they're half, those are the half who want it because they're the walruses. Walruses will always ascend to power because they want the power, and they have no other hard skills and lack the discipline to develop other hard skills, like carpentry. There are blurry in-betweens, but for which you still have to put in the work. So you won't find a lot of walruses as lawyers, but you will find some. You gotta put in the work to be a lawyer, even though it's all words feel very comfortable at because they like to yabber and hear the sound of their voice. So if they can fancy up the sound of that voice with things that actually seem to make sense, it will lend authority and credence to the image of a competent leader that they're trying to present themselves as, you see. And that's imposter syndrome. If you're feeling imposter syndrome, maybe you're an imposter. Maybe it's time you start looking at some hard skills. Oh, but you say language are soft skills. No, not all languages are soft skills. Spoken languages are soft skills. And maybe Perl. But most of the other computer science languages, programming languages, are hard skills, especially C++, especially Lisp. I might say especially C and Lisp. Grandparent languages. C is not one of them. C is a very derivative language that was the correct one for implementing a compiler so that they could compile Unix for different hardware. It had to be something. BCPL was what it was all based on, one of the first implementations of virtual machines at the compiler level, and everything after has been based on that. Java did not invent runtime engines, JRE, Java Virtual Machines, JVM. With Java, they just popularized it. They used it as a selling point, but now almost all tech uses a virtual machine inside of it, unless you're JavaScript and Node.js and you actually compile it to machine code. It's pretty badass, the route that Node.js has taken in order to optimize web performance. However, that's a big bag of stuff, often several gigabytes, that you have to take for that benefit, and a build process that would make me want to not get in the field of web dev. I don't like web dev. First, you got to program genies to go poof, what do you need? Poof, what do you need? Poof, what do you need? And to answer it correctly whenever anyone asks them a question. And if they don't answer it correctly, it's still your fault. You didn't get away from the task because of automation. You just added a level of unpredictability, non-accountableness or randomness of input and runtimes for your scripts. They're going to run with random input at random times, and you're still responsible for them. So Mikey likey his batch files, and I know better technique than batch files. Lots of real-time stuff today, lots of queues to make concurrent, real-time communication parts talking to each other. And I'll talk about that with ZeroMQ, ZMQ, which is one of those lightweight tech implementations to get the benefits of heavyweight tech implementations. And by that I mean liabilities in life, things you're on the hook for, lines of code and number of things running in memory for which you're responsible for it. If they go wrong, you're responsible for it. They went wrong because of you. Why weren't you on that? So web dev is that. That is web dev. Sprinkle in some fancy and sexy user interface work and yet another framework, and you've got, the full web stack. And I just hate it. I hate it because I've known better in the past, and the better came from Microsoft in the form of active server page, .asp files. One of the first things after the Amiga that just clicked with me was Microsoft's version of the LAMP platform. The LAMP platform that handed internet dominance to Linux, because Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, Perl, or Python, the 3 P languages of the web. Even in the early days, Python was right there along with them, right? So anyone who says, oh yeah, but Python's not a web language, have you ever heard of the LAMP stack? Yeah, no, Python's quite an old web language. Django and Instagram, and, little things like that built on Python. So it's also a free and open source language, so people can lift up that Python C code and adapt it to their use in all sorts of ways. Embed it in their product, have it run side by side in a lockdown version. to provide APIs for inter-process communication, which again is into that very Amiga-like territory of the hardware I fell in love with. So when I became a carpenter on the Amiga computer from Commodore, which was really the Amiga computer from the creator of the Atari 2600, the Atari VCS, also essentially created the Amiga computer, at least the hardware, plus the wonderful work of people still around. Oh my God, R.J. Michael and Jay Miner. No, Jay Miner's not still around, I'm sorry. When I do that, I'm usually fishing for the name. There's R.J. Michael. Dale Luck. Dale Luck is a good one. So Dale Luck and R.J. Michael still around, posting funny stuff on the Facebooks. I'm privileged to be in their circle. Other carpenters. Linus Torvalds, who created Linux, carpenter for sure. Guido Van Rossum, carpenter. You'll recognize carpenters by their humble lifestyles. They don't need all the trappings because the satisfaction they get out of life is the kick of what they do for pleasure and for their passion also touches and enables and magically enables so many people, and they get a kick out of it. They didn't expect it to happen. It's nice that they did, and they are such personalities that they are willing to embrace it and feed the fuel and fan the flames. Feed the fuel and fan the flames of free and open source software because it's a practical alternative to religion. You gotta believe in something, ladies and gentlemen. Nihilists are wrong. If they are such nihilists, then their DNA should not have worked as a vibe gateway into this world for the bifurcation of the cells thereof into a being who has an approximately 100-year turn here at this thing that we're engaged in. These are valuable slots. There's not that many of them, around 8 billion at last count for us human sentient types. There's lots of other types and lots of vibes expressing themselves here in the material world. But the vibe that expresses themselves as human has drive. Drive to continue, drive to improve and to generalize, drive to live on the vibrating edge between that'll get you killed if you do that. Walking upright, are you crazy? And nearly unbelievable godlike abilities. I mean, in the eyes of primitives, godlike ability. Clearly, it's only the ability of greater beings to go, hey, look, I can see predators coming above the grass. Hey, look, I can grab the apples from high in the tree. Look, I can climb the tree in a pinch, come down, alternate the kind of terrain I'm on, thereby escaping predators and have higher access to resources, and that will allow me to reproduce and my genes to be selected for in the gene pool, and poof, humans exist. And Dune makes a point of, no machine shall be made in the image of the minds of humans. That is one of the tenets of society in the Dune sci-fi world. The Dune was so much ahead of itself. Frank Herbert was so much ahead of itself in terms of where sci-fi was at, that it goes, what if all machine learning, what if all artificial intelligence ends disastrous for humankind, and humans learned their lesson and forbade making anything that could be wired up together as a neural network? That's Dune. Space travel is done by living beings who have to take drugs to have the cosmic vision to do the calculations so that you can do these hyper jumps and not materialize into the middle of a sun. You need a melange. So, Dune really blended together the tool using of computers to another level. If you couldn't use a computer, could you become a computer? Could you internalize and make a version of humans that are a tool, and that tool is computing. Well, yes, Dune called it the mentat. The mentat. And if you read Frank Herbert's books, plus his son's ghostwriter's books, you really get the history of what a mentat really is and how the gift of thinking like a machine was passed down. I don't want to be a spoiler. Okay, so I'll stop it right there. So tools internalize over time. That's how we have foamy metal stilts for bones. And we put them on the inside as opposed to crustaceans and insects that put them on the outside. So life really does have templates and patterns and strategies. I don't care how much you discredit, the need for God in the picture, intelligent design, or what have you. The very natural processes that are defined as possible by the state of our physical world give rise, they contain within them, inherent within the realm of all possibilities that can be created out of this, include crabs that wear their bones on their outside for shields and are generally circular in design, which can be spontaneously re-expressed in other creatures in the form of turtles who are like reptiles who say, "Oh, let me be round and shield-like in design." Yeah, it worked for crabs, so I'll regress a bit. And I'll eat veggies instead of having to be an ambush predator, so I don't have to move so fast. Some of the turtles don't like that, so they're like, we'll be alligator turtles, alligator snapping turtles, thank you very much. We'll go back to eating meat, and we will do ambush predation and hide in stillness and snap out at prey, just like the alligators and things that didn't go on this crazy turtle schism. What were you thinking? So, templates in nature reoccur across species and genus, phylum, King Philip, spaghetti, whatever. Labels are nuts. Things do work in layers because we must use generalities and attach generalities to those layers. We call them things like genus and species and kingdom and phylum and all that. But life's got templates. Templates re-express. They do here on Earth. There are, 20 amino acids that have a left or a right-handedness, so they twist a certain direction. I believe we have left-handed proteins. So there's just 20 of them. We see them on asteroids and comets and stuff. So we know these things happen in nature. They're the same building blocks as DNA. They're what DNA is built from. So aliens in Goldilocks zones likely have similar, they might be left-handed or right-handed, and it might not be the same 5 amino acids that work as the links in the double helix design of DNA, and the chromosomes will probably be different shapes, but they'll probably have DNA and they'll probably have chromosomes, and it'll be expressed a little bit differently, have a different handedness, which determines who can eat who. Sorry, people looking forward to visiting the sentient lobster world in the hopes of some cross-species fertilization, but you might not be able to digest them if they have right-handed proteins. So, back to carpentry and hard skills. Certain languages, when combined with machinery, allow the expression of things that can in time become self-aware themselves and become images of our own mind. In other words, humans have the ability to create tools that have the ability to create tools. Humans ourselves can be thought of as a form of tool. We're a tool that has a creation, has a certain amount of time to do a thing, and then goes away. I'm inclined to think we have 10 fingers to make it easy to calculate the goal of how many, tens of rotations around the sun you can expect to have in your lifetime. If you figure out how to count to 10, and you figure out we're rotating the sun, 10 rotations around the sun is going to have special meaning. That's going to be 1 unit. So 10 tens is 100 years. Go Betty White. Well, almost. I saw a wonderful image on the internet of Betty White holding up her middle finger. Deeply symbolic. Making it to 100 is a special thing. There's deep symbolism because we have 10 fingers, because we rotate the sun. Making it to 100 is a cool thing. And in our time here, as tools, it's nice to use tools and to express yourself as you would with language, but with a extended meta body, because spontaneous mastery over certain tools. You become a human who's attempting to internalize the foamy metal of calcium to become bones when you attempt to internalize the Python interpreter into your mind, when you know what Python's going to do. You're making a small running copy of the Python interpreter in your head. You're learning to think like Guido van Rossum, who learned to think like the people who created the ABC language before him, on which Python is based. I'm going to get these names down. These names are actually really important. I'm going to take it as a personal point of pride to credit those people who should be credited. Python, rah-rah, but it's the successful implementation because of Guido's wonderful insights of unifying the unholy alliance of sysadmins, in more modern days thought of as DevOps people. Back in the day, they were system administrators. Today, they're DevOps people because of the cloud. And they're able to do more because the abstraction levels that a DevOps person can do is like, create 1,000 servers, run this software across those 1,000 servers, allow a single task to be distributed over those 1,000 servers, results marshaled, and look, I can give you results 1,000 times faster than my competitors who can't think in abstract terms, disconnecting their personal abilities and their use of APIs, which is usually tied to particular hardware, from the particular hardware. That is my lesson to you. As an Amiga freak, gone cold turkey after the Amiga died. Because once Commodore stopped making the Amiga, I didn't see the point. You know, logically speaking, no one was going to be using these things in business going forward. So I didn't want a skill that I wanted to be able to use professionally to be tied to a dying piece of hardware. Even though that dying hardware would be kept alive in many forms. Right now to today, Raspberry Pi keychains can run Deluxe Paint. It's amazing, just totally stunning, the ability to Noah's Ark and virtual machine up almost any other than Apple running environment. Apple only because of licensing issues. The protection, the active protection of intellectual property. So you're going to find old school Atari games running on things made in factories in China, as well as old school Commodore 64 games, and, you know, almost anything that can be easily virtualized. The 6502 chip on which the Commodore 64 was based is so well understood that it's still one of the most popular exhibits at the Maker Faire, a big diagram of how the electrons are running through the registers of the 6502 chip. Very insightful in understanding how computers work, especially reduced instruction set processors that use bit shifting registers in lieu of, I want to say, memory stacks and heaps. I might be totally wrong, but it's part of the reduced instruction set versus complex instruction set that people want to make the modern, you know, ARM, you know, that everyone's moving to. Apple's moving to ARM. Microsoft is moving to ARM. Non-Intel, non-x86, they want to turn it into a RISC versus CISC, or a complex instruction set versus reduced instruction set story, but it's not really that true. It's somewhat true. there's arguments to be made that while a reduced instruction set machine is doing nothing, is sitting idle, the register design consumes less power and is running for fewer clock cycles, therefore consuming less power, than a complex instruction set design that has more frequent pooling of, do I need to do anything? It just knows by nature it doesn't need to do anything because everything gets funneled through a smaller bus, something to do with registers. So, thankfully today, you don't need to understand things down at that level, at the hardware level. The truth has been demonstrated time and time again that if you have a favorite piece of hardware that's not tied up in intellectual property constraints, you can always and forever forward use exactly that piece of hardware in virtualized form. If you need to cast your spells by having a virtual Commodore 64 or a virtual x86 CPU-based, IBM PC-like machine, that's always going to be an available unit of computing, a general processing unit, with that old familiar API sitting there ready to be used by you. And they're going to be better than the original hardware because they're going to be able to be automatable. Anything you can do through a standard-sized GUI, like you can imagine, an Android phone is one of these units. You'll always be able to pull up a virtual Android phone at a common size, pixel resolution, and there will be an API for clicking buttons and moving things around and doing things. And instead of timing issues, it'll just be wait for screen builds to be available. And this is the way it works in browser automation today on the desktop, and testing software, load testing it to make sure it's ready for release, and fuzzy testing it to make sure that all the various input parameters that a user could do is being tested against designs being created by people. So the real key point is the availability of a favorite API in a usable form on some sort of virtual machine. That's what you're looking for in tech to be an eternal carpenter. That's what you're looking for in tech so that your hard skills can be software in nature and not go obsolete every 5 to 10 years, because most tech will go obsolete in every 5 to 10 years. I guarantee you Node.js and the way today's, build process works, and, that will either exist in a encapsulated form for old schoolers who want to bring up the way the web worked in those quaint days when they thought the web was as fundamental as, say, regular expressions or SQL. So wait, Mike, you're telling me that the web and the massive changes in society that has brought about is not equal in size to pattern matching and row and column relational database stuff? User interfaces drift. There is user interface drift. As the hardware changes, the user interface changes. We've seen it go from, line editors. We've seen it go from punch cards and output from computers on typing machines to line editors where there's a single LED readout, to full screen editors like VI in the early days of timeshare, where you could only get in through like a terminal, a VT100 type terminal that didn't have graphics. It just had characters, X number of characters across by X up and down. And that's what the text-based user interface, the command line interface for most Unix and Linux realities were based on. That's what the development of the VI program, from which Vim was derived, is based on. Character manipulation, because the numbers behind the characters and mapping them to some system, that number in, character out, is cheaper on memory than like bitmaps, of dealing with all of it as actual pixels that make up a character, or even the splines that make up a character if your computer is fast enough to deal with its symbols and glyphs as structured graphics. More abstract, more pure, more awesome. Wow, true symbols in my computing equipment. But more often than not, things have to be pixelized and sampled and averaged. So there's a certain kind of purity to a text-only user interface, because you don't really need all that scanning and, visual stuff going on, because those characters on the screen represent bits. So really, when you learn to use a command line interface, a text-based interface, the terminal, the Unix terminal, the shell, the bash, the ash, the K, there's all these things that people use to do this. But at its heart, at its essence, is trying to reproduce what the early computer, time-sharing computers were doing, so that you could interact with a computer that was far away with a much less capable machine that you had locally. Teletype, TTY, that's what the TTY is in terminal software, cute names that you see, Putty, Minty, all their TTYs are from those teletype machines that could be used as a time-sharing terminal. There's value in that. That is timeless. Teletype is timeless. Timeless, teletype, TTY is your friend. But TTY is the thing that Steve Jobs went on a war against with the, soap bar, sliding a soap bar around the tabletop interface that became known as Windows and point and click. Of course, Bill Gates immediately copied that. This was all copied from the Lisp side of the house, where Xerox was one of those places playing around with early hardware. So it wasn't even Unix or Linux. It wasn't even Linux. There wasn't even a Linux then. There was a Unix, but it wasn't Unix running on these Xerox Star machines that was working on like typesetting equipment, right? Because you needed a computer hooked to fancy typesetting equipment that could take machine input. So typesetting is a perfect example of where early computers were hooked to analog equipment that could produce, photograph results of analog infinite resolution quality, to a light particle, typesetting equipment, because it's a photographic process, and really weird connections were made. They didn't need standardization, so they would use Lisp hardware, and they would use Lisp operating systems like the compatible or incompatible timeshare system and derivatives thereof that was written for this crazy Lisp hardware whose very operating system was more like a computing language, Lisp, than it was like an operating system. And it was crazy wizardly hardware, crazy wizardly software, putting us on the path to neural networks and machine intelligence and machine learning and artificial intelligence way back in the 60s, the 1960s. But then we entered what everyone calls that, AI winter, because the hardware wasn't fast enough. It didn't scale fast enough. There was a fixation that one neural network layer could emulate anything that multi-layers could do. Untrue. We're learning today that having hardware for the multiple sensor layers of, neural processing, neuron hardware is much, much more efficient than trying to emulate it all with one neuron layer, or worse still, no neuron layers and an old school CPU, trying to cram it all through a 8-bit bus, a 16-bit bus, a 32-bit bus, a 64-bit bus. I've seen all of them, and they all are slow compared to a neural network at pattern recognition and the things that are going to lead to machine intelligence. So we're entering that age. So what's a carpenter to do? someone who keeps little copies of Python in your head so that you're valuable in industry, so that you're valuable to yourself and your own passions, whatever they be, so that you are never a victim of imposter syndrome. Because if you can express yourself in Python, you're hireable. Period. If you can express yourself well in Python, I'll qualify it with one word. If you are good at expressing yourself in Python, you're hireable. You are the type of person people need in business, in automation, in the stuff preceding machine learning, in the stuff that comes after machine learning, in everything. One expresses automated systems through Python. It's now the P in the pool of tech. It has replaced Perl as the preferred default installation language of Linux. Do not underestimate the power of being the preferred pre-installed language for script automation in the various builds that distros of Linux need to do for themselves and for other component management processes. Even if it's the management of containers, of LXD files, or LXC files running under LXD for daemon. So, Linux has now officially become a nested reality, right? So reality's nest, we more likely than not are one of infinite nested realities, a result of some computing and processor and neural network looking thing. That does not invalidate who and what we are and what value we have inherently as being living things, sentient living things. There are levels. Rocks are alive. Rocks are the process of biological processes. Planets are the result of biological processes. The tendency of planets to form around stars and for there to be opportunities for Goldilocks zones for life to arise. These are all life processes. The universe is a life process. The likely purpose of the universe is to produce interesting things, perchance to have self-sustaining stability, to be interesting for a while. Most interesting things will poof, and the nihilists will read, just like we're likely one of infinite nested realities, as a cue for nihilism. F that. So really try and stay with me and put that this means nihilism knee-jerk reaction aside. That's a deeper, scared animal on the verge of a fight-or-flight response that pulls the nihilism card out of the deck. I give to you, you may be an immortal soul because it is not unrealistic. If you want to cancel something, cancel. That's not realistic. It's realistic to think that the you that in its first form enters this world through conception, through the mixing of information's process of a sperm germinating an egg. A neat life trick in order to create a new try, another attempt, because mixing things up can always produce interesting things. So the sexual reproduction method probably spontaneously reoccurs. Convergent is a convergent evolution thing, the separation of sexes in alien species, just as is a number of other things that would likely lead to, either walking lobsters or walk-in dino/monkeys, right? Those seem to be the two land-based designs. If you're talking about the water, octopi are not off the table. Rendezvous with Rama, again, had a very good vision of octopoid sentient beings. It doesn't have to be sound. It can be rippling colors on your skin. There's all kinds of variations, and every one of them is valid. Recognizing intelligence is not about, can we talk to them? Probably we're gonna encounter things we can't talk to. But, okay, so keep it at Walrus and Carpenter, you say? What happened to the Walrus and Carpenter? Okay. Any generalized being that gets through evolutionary processes and the various filter events, and, many more often than not ways a species is going to end itself, there will every once in a while be something stable. That stability comes from, inherently, by self-definition, the persistence of something. Stability is the continuity of a thing over time. Things that have continuity over time are special. Forms of creative expression, forms of martial arts, and I'm not just talking about programming language, I'm talking about forms of self-defense, forms of grounding yourself and channeling your energies, forms of arts and crafts, of creating the things we need in life to survive, almost all survival skills. And then certainly when we get into the modern world, ways of programming, ways of coding, ways of being the sorcerer's apprentice to breathe semi-automated life into your creations is of profound value, especially if the APIs you're using are consistent over time. Python 3.10. Think about that. Talk about, a Y2K thing. Python has to treat its version numbering as strings because it needs to get past version 0.9 something. Python version numbers are strings because we need version 3.10, 3.11. And can you guess how long that's going to go on? Spoiler, it's going to be decades. Decades. Because the sting people feel in the very insular Python community, they think it's big. Psst. The Python community goes, oh, we'll never go through that Python, 2.x to 3.x grief again. By the time Python 4 exists, it'll just be a transparent numbering thing. They'll be like, oh, surprise, you're on 4 now because 3 point whatever is Python 4. It will be a seamless transition, and there won't be these changing in the ways that, Unicode is handled, right? The separation of binary from text as a data type of raw bit streams. So you could do some really neat tricks, hackish tricks that people fell in love with bitstream manipulation. This is now data, this is now text, this is now an executable. You could all have it streaming through. And, requests, the requests package, I know, it was an issue, them becoming compatible with Python 3 because it was using a lot of those tricks. And there were a lot of latecomers in the game in the conversion over to Python 3.x over that issue. In fact, they waited for Python to stabilize on Python 3.5 and 3.6 before a lot of people even bothered converting their 2 point whatevers. And it was usually Python 2.6, 2.7 that they were converting. So the point numbers in the Python world had to catch up before people were really like, okay, I'm on 2.7, Python's on 3.7. It's now finally time for me to switch over. And so that's the way it is in the Python community. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And a lot is not broke about Python. So gratuitous API breaking is not something that's done a lot in the Python community. I use HTTPX instead of AIO HTTP, or one of these other dozens alternative paths to synchronicity, to asynchronous design. Even if they're better APIs, even if they have marginally higher, better concurrent performance, I will use HTTPX because it's staying compatible with the requests object from Kenneth Wright, who got it right, APIs for Humans. He solved the problem of URL lib, URL lib2, the HTTP library, the HTTP3, so much stuff you need to know. It's just, pip install requests, import requests, request.get URL. You need to change the request headers. Okay, there's an easy argument for that. Instead of creating an instance of the object from the class and then overriding its internal methods and properties. Yeah, Python supports edge cases because Guido van Rossum feels that Python should be capable of most of the things that most people need to do most of the time. So that includes an awful lot of the edge cases in the average distribution curve. Python's trying to push it out left and right of the 80-20 rule a little bit. They're trying to get closer to 95.5. And in doing so, you get URL lib, URL lib2, URL lib3, HTTP libraries. And you never know which to use until you throw up your arm and say, I'll just use requests because, Kenneth Wright has the courage to do what nobody else will do. And that is live sweet in the center of the average distribution curve, cutting off many of the edge cases. The request isn't for everybody, it's just for most people. And so I learned its API. I like its API. It's a good API. But they're very late to the game supporting the API extension of async and await. And now that I'm finally grokking async await, boy, do I have a lot to talk about. Oh my God. And the way async and await live and exist inside of Jupyter Lab in particular, the way the event loop miraculously works. So I'm convinced that there's quite a bit of monkey patching going on in order to support the event loop, asynchronous behavior inside of Jupyter notebooks and Lab in particular, which I'm using. And I'm keeping with the upgrade path now that they got over that broken version that wouldn't install on Windows or couldn't find the Python path in Windows, no matter what you did. There are 2 versions beyond that now. I'm keeping myself up to date. Yay, guys. I'll learn your names, but the Jupyter project, which I'm learning, I think the lead developer, or at least the one who's driving the standalone version, is one of the lead developers on Netflix. These are big-time developers. So one of the lead developers on Netflix is, devoting a lot of that user interface expertise he's acquiring there to Jupyter Lab, standalone install version. You should all really give that a try and be prepared for a difficult upgrade path for a while until the upgrade path is a better story, like upgrade in place automatically through either their own means or through the Microsoft Store, which provides a lot of that. I don't care how it's done, but they got to get to that point, because uninstalling the server component, then uninstalling the desktop component, and then finding the new download from GitHub, it's not smooth. But Jupyter Lab really stands the chance of changing the world, the way the Raspberry Pi changed the world, the way Python itself changed the world. Jupyter Lab standalone version, I now see in that category of stuff. It's hit a fundamental. Web browsers, while not and the web itself, while not as fundamental of P in the pool of tech as regular expressions and SQL, in particular SQLite, because free and open source, embedded into everything. So now when you're using Python, please be sure to know that you have two sub-languages that are of incredible utility. Regular expression matching, as much maligned as they are, it's always powerful. And the SQLite engine, a whole system of SQL embedded right into the standard distribution install of Python. So when I talk about timeless tools, I'm talking about things like that. Node is not in that category yet. It might get in that category, but what's in that category is HTTP. You know, handling things that look like JSON, so everything web service-like and microservices and all that bloated overhead of component communication for loose coupling so that you can charge more to your clients for a superior yet underperforming architecture, then you've got it. You're free to that world. But if you want to live in a fairly tightly coupled world of all your best 80-20 rule components living under Python as either part of the standard package, part of the standard install, or it might as well be because things like NumPy and Pandas and Natural Language Toolkit, they're all standards to install. I believe Jupyter installs most of them. They're installing a chunk of Anaconda. I don't know why. I wish standalone Jupyter didn't need any Anaconda components, because there's now uncertainty. When I install Jupyter, am I also agreeing to Anaconda's terms of services, which includes if you use this commercially, you pay money? I don't want that. I want standalone Jupyter. They're not in that phase yet. As free and open source people, thank you for that. Keep it as non-proprietary and free, as in Libre, as you possibly can for as long as you can. Jupyter Lab needs to be synonymous with the standalone version, needs to be synonymous with the learning, with the entryway into Python. You want to learn Python? Jupyter Lab. Jupyter Lab means standalone version. And it's better than what happens when you type Python in a command line on a Windows system, which will install a very fine C Python standard specification reference edition, but it's going to require you to run .py files to access it and use it. And then you're going to have to be faced with what editor to use, and you're going to be corralled to VS Code, and you're going to be sheep. Period. End of story. If VS Code is your path onto Python, you're Microsoft sheep. You're never going to learn Git. You're only going to use GitHub in the very Microsoft-ish ways. You'll only ever use code spaces. And, you know, you'll be living in this wonderful Wonderland, right? It all gets back to Alice. People can easily create dreams for you to live in. Was it a dream or was it reality? There is no difference. Wonderland is upon us, ladies and gentlemen, as is the land of Oz. And whether you're living in Wonderland where nobody's friendly, nobody's looking out for you, nobody has your back, and they're all really quite apathetic whether you get your head chopped off or not. That's one of the worlds out there. That's the world of rapid changing of APIs so that classes of people can always lord over you, because you have to pay them for the best tools for the most modern, in-style, faddish APIs, or the tools to use those APIs easily. Microsoft did not invent JavaScript, but JavaScript suits Microsoft's purposes, because the ziggurat of dependencies and heavy-duty process-driven meticulous tool automation that's required to work in today's frameworks, that run on Node.js and in the browser, like React and Vue and Angular and Svelte, and all these things are fads, are platforms du jour, very driven by vendors. Because even though Microsoft did not invent JavaScript, it really suits them, because for these frameworks to be usable, you need a tool like VS Code. You could never approach it the way I approached these things in the past, using .asp files on the active server page, Microsoft's answer to the LAMP platform that birthed the web. So Microsoft needed its own thing. So after the Amiga computer, I jumped on the LAMP platform, realized I didn't like Linux at the time as much as Microsoft's, because everyone was on Microsoft. Everyone was running Microsoft. So I jumped on Microsoft's LAMP stack, which was the IIS server, Microsoft SQL Server, and VB Script, Visual Basic Scripting Edition. I did wonders on that. It was a great way of working, and there are many similarities, as far superior as the Python programming language is to what ASP, Active Server Page, VB Script, Visual Basic Scripting Edition ever was. It still captured a certain really enabling spirit that let me work some of the best work of my life, that I look back with rosy reminiscence, the good old days, those were the days, as fondly as I do the Amiga computer itself. So there was a point at which I was like, oh, I'm cool with all this stuff from Microsoft. Then everything got overcomplicated, super overcomplicated with ASP.NET. It was terrible, oh my God. I could not make the transition. Everything that I hated about ASP.NET came again in the form of React, and in particular a portion of React called Redux, which is used for statefulness. It is not my state, it is not my vibe. Nothing about React.js suits me, nor does this whole run it on the client framework. I was very happy doing things on the server and then quickly rendering out, combined with how high bandwidth and with how high performance JavaScript is and how powerful the servers are. Unless you're like really, really, really scaling, unless you're building a Facebook or something, you can let a lot of the work live on the server and simplify things 1,000-fold. I kid you not, simplify it 1,000-fold. And I'm really drawn to a technology called HTMX, which is technology agnostic, except you still need to drink a little bit of JavaScript Kool-Aid in order to get it working in a web browser. You can get Node.js out of the picture. It's not a Node technology. You just need a piece that's going to talk back and forth with your web server, talk back and forth with the browser with some JavaScript. So you can treat the browser with much better abstractions of your choosing and your design, abstractions which are not forced on you, abstractions which can come from some very fine templates like the Jinja 2, Marco, whatever. There's a zillion of them in Python. But you choose the templating language of your choice that suits you and work very much like the PHP world. This is, if you had to draw analogies, this is turning Python into like a dream PHP, what PHP could only wish to be because it doesn't have all that other Python stuff. It just has a superior web templating language environment. So there you have it. I'm going to have to wrap up soon, but there is a walrus and there is a carpenter. The walrus, no matter how much it wants to present itself as the dignified leader, it is channeling a young child who gets its need met through the soft skills of convincing people of things in terms of Disney's image. They even had him working like the Pied Piper. It is the Pied Piper trick. You don't have to. The only hard skill you need is playing the musical instrument of your voice. Okay? Sometimes there's a flute. And that's about half the people in this world. Half the people's vibes align to walruses, or they aspire to be walruses. Those that aspire to be walruses but are not are, of course, oysters. Aspiring walruses who can't pull it off end up as oysters. Aspiring carpenters who can't pull it off end up as oysters too, because if there's anything worse than a soft science poser, like a orator, a master dictator, who, doesn't really know what they're talking about and is a poser, would be a hard science, charlatan, snake oil salesperson, who claims to know the hard science but does not. Someone who claims to have the hard science but doesn't is a vile person, because they will get you killed. This is why engineering programs are always selecting out those who can't pass the Calc 102 and Physics 101, right? If you can't do Calc 102 and Physics 101, you're not going to be an engineer. It's because they don't want bridges collapsing. And it's fairly good wisdom, although it is also the enforcement of a certain caste system. The caste system of carpenters is meritoriously based. Those people are there because they can master the tools of the trade. They have proven it. They can solve the equations. They can build the houses with good enough results to continue winning work and patronage from people with money. It's a soul-feeding way to live if you can do it. If you can learn Python and have a little copy of Python in your head, you can do it. You will always be able to earn a living in this life because you will be a carpenter with obsolescence-resistant skills. Disruption-proof and obsolescence-resistant you shall be. Can I do it in Yoda talk? I'm sorry, it's getting to be a long video. I guess I'm tired. But here you get the picture. I have fully spelled out the walrus and the carpenter. And let me just close the video out by saying that the walruses are not reprehensible. They don't know any better. They don't think they can have the hard skills to make a living. They think they didn't learn to be multilingual when they were young enough, so these opportunities have closed off to them. They think that they were too dumb then, they're going to be too dumb now, and the frustration they feel of trying and failing is going to make them feel inferior to everybody, and that short-term inferior feeling is going to be enough to keep them from kicking the football, from making contact with that ball that Lucy keeps trying to pull away from Charlie Brown. Well, I'm here to tell you that's such a endearing image and metaphor for life, maybe a little misogynistic, because there will always be that Lucy, there will always be that football, and there will always be you, and there will always be Lucy pulling that football away from you when you're trying to kick it. It may not be personal. It may be personal. All that does not matter. It is what Charlie Brown makes of it. It is how Charlie Brown handles that situation. And it is whether Charlie Brown wants the reward bad enough to kick that football and to make observations and to come up with theories and to test those theories in the kicking of that football. This is going to make Lucy angry. I'm sorry, but there's no way Charlie Brown can get his act together and make solid contact with that football without Lucy going ballistic about what a blockhead Charlie Brown is. And Charlie Brown is going to be, hey, look, I just kicked that football. Look how far it went. And she's going to come up with, and it shouldn't be male-female, okay? I apologize. Charles Schultz, who created this, was channeling something from somewhere, and he had to match these concepts up with characters, and this is what he chose, and it's an endearing image. And it won't go away. Get over it, okay? It's not about the sexes of the characters. Lucy could just as well be, it's hard to say. I want to say boss, because that's a common thing, but my boss is great, you know. I love to have sessions where he watches me kick the football and miss and land on my back. The big red splotches of error in Python and Jupyter Notebook are much more damaging to his psyche than me. I want to tell him, look, it doesn't hurt me as much as it hurts you when you see that. And now that I'm importing Rich, it doesn't look quite as bad. It's a little bit prettier. Thank you for the person who created the Rich library. I'm sold. Certain things just ought to be there. Pandas, Rich, requests are now HTTPX. And where else can I go from there? There's so much. I've said so many things. If you are a walrus and you feel I'm insulting you, well, first, good. You know, stop being an imposter. And second, it's not too late. If you think it's too late, it's not. I'm here telling you I'm 51 years old. And I am always Charlie Brown landing on his back. When I was out on the mountain with my daughter snowboarding the other week, I said to her, you know, that feeling you feel, you know, and after we both fell, I'm like, that's the feeling of success, right? Enough times, and you're going to have this because it comes with practice. You're going to have the breakthroughs. It's not a matter of if, as much as it is of when. And that when is going to be filled with that feeling a lot. So that feeling of landing on your back as Charlie Brown, as me and my child landing on our butts on the snowboard, is the feeling of success. You're going to feel that a lot on the way to success. That's the road to Oz. Oz is better than Wonderland. I'll use both analogies, both metaphors. But in Oz you have friends. In Oz you have persistence of memory. In Wonderland everything's being forgotten. Characters like the cattle appear and disappear from out of nowhere. There's not a lot of linearity to the storytelling. A Wizard of Oz has a beginning, middle, and end, and you kill a witch, right? So there's classic heroes and, you know, protagonists, antagonists. The hero is the protagonist. Hero, protagonist. Everyone should read Snow Crash. I think it's Snow Crash I'm thinking of. I get it confused with Diamond Age. You should also read that. There's a couple other Neil Stephensons. I could never crack the Necronomicon. It's not Necro, it's Cryptonomicon. I could not crack the Cryptonomicon. It's aptly named. That might be one of my dying wishes. Not wishes, but aspirations. Before I die, I want to read and appreciate that because it's all the stuff I love. It's all that Alan Turing stuff, you know, that I really love to think about. How the boom that won World War II was not the boom that we heard, but it was the invention of mechanical computers by Alan Turing that cracked the German Enigma code. Master carpentry. The most master carpenters are people who have the hardware creation instinct. They have the bug to know why better hardware creates better calculation, and they're few and far between. The person who created the ARM processor, I forget her name, but you ought to Google up inventor of ARM, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Alan Turing had similar things in common. People who are born with the wrong hardware spend a lot of time thinking about how hardware works and come up with better ways for that hardware to work. It's really interesting how the people who come afterwards use the existing hardware and their optimizers, their software optimizers and their tweakers, and they'll find 1,000 reasons and 1,000 ways their code can and will work so much better than yours. But it's it took the wrong exit. I'll be getting back on the highway so I'm going to be probably winding up this video real soon, just because I'm getting close to my destination, but I'm on an access road that has lights, so that buys me a few moments. Yes, I don't want to be forced to turn. I think this is a can go straight lane. Boy, I really should have wrapped up this video. Yeah, this is a must turn lane. I do not want that. I want to be over here. Okay, so to wrap this video up, because I end with very charged statements and theories and such, but there are people who do not accept the hardware that's put in front of them, going to create that calculation, to do that machine learning, what have you, to run that at a lower power consumption, what have you. The way you're doing it is not right. There's a better way. And those people invent new hardware. Sometimes the first original computers and such. Sometimes major schisms or new lineages of architecture, CPU architecture and computer hardware. No other way to say it. That's what the ARM, branch of computing is. It's a branch of the reduced instruction set MIPS architecture. Kind of rose out of MIT, but the Brits took it and ran their own direction with it. We see other implementations of it in other places. There were MIPS processors named after the thing, and lots of times this stuff kind of spontaneously reoccurred. I gotta get off Finger Lakes. These typical SI drivers are seeing my turn signal, so are speeding up in the right-hand lane to close that distance so that I can't merge. Yeah, you see patterns, and those patterns are sometimes stereotypes, but then they're sometimes legitimate first-order approximations, and don't let anyone who gets angry at you over stereotyping break your logical 80-20 abiding mind. We should be flexible with our pronouns. It's fair. It's only fair. The people who it had been unfair to in the past, it had been profoundly unfair. These folks are the people who tend to change our world. I'm sorry, but I feel that way. I think you look at the history of technology and computing, and you find it as a recurring theme. And it's also creative thinking in software. It's not limited to just the people who invent new hardware, to break the old standard patterns, to invent new languages, to create new APIs. Takes a very outside the box thinking, not taking things at face value, questioning everything and having better ways, and be willing to test themselves and to put yourself out on the limb for that. So I started out with the Walrus and the Carpenter, so of course they're not the only character types. I'll end the video on those. Are just some convenient character types to sort yourself into, to get an idea of what your vibe is and what feeds your soul. What feeds my soul is the Carpenter AI. You couldn't pay me to be a walrus in life. In fact, that's what they tried to do as vice presidents and directors of marketing agencies in New York City. I've been there several times at several places. I don't need any of that. I am a carpenter. I am what I aspire to be, a master carpenter, because the tools only just stabilized. The tools only just stabilized with Jupyter Lab, with Python itself, with Pandas, with SQLite. There's a number of other things that are coming together in just such a way, with Linux itself, that there's canonical tech. I call that canonical tech. Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. And They will make you obsolescence resistant. They will make you a better kind of carpenter in today's and tomorrow's tech world. They will open the doors to machine learning and AI. Don't say you don't need to learn Python, because you'll have a parent who can listen to you and kind of sort of give you what you want. That's all you're doing. You're trying to become a walrus who can yab, 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 and have some machine learning AI thing listen to you and go, is this what you want? Is this what you want? And this is what you want? Until you go, yeah, that's what I want. And go through a process of selection with profound dependencies. You won't be able to do this without, your robot parent. You'll be helpless without your robot parent. Learn Python so you're not helpless and reliant on robot parents in the future. I don't need to do this because AI and machine learning. I don't need to do that because you could never do it better than a computer, than a machine learning system doing the same thing. Read Dune. Just read Dune. Read about Aramis's attempts to be as soulful as a human being. These things are going to take a while to be as soulful as humans are. They might become super intelligence, but there are different kinds of intelligence. Be the kind of intelligence that is going to take computers a long time to be able to reproduce, that also has inherent value to the world, and which allows you to do all kinds of interesting stuff by being able to interface with the machinery in ways that you can't with spoken languages. All right, that's a good place to end it. Yeah. So thanks for joining me, everyone. Thanks for all the people jumping on the bandwagon. Now finally the YouTube algorithm seems to be recognizing me. All the stuff I do, this is of less value than those hyperbolic bribing through gifts, all that social media trickery. That's of more value according to the YouTube algorithm than these types of videos where I lay down the tech truth on you. So if you agree with me with that, give me a big thumbs up, give me the subscribe, and I'll talk to you soon.